2 words about myself. I'm a professor in media and journalism studies at Oslo Metropolitan University. We have 2 large universities in Oslo now. There used to be one, the University of Oslo, and then there is mine, which used for many years to be a university college, and that is where we had the journalism education. And then recently my university college also became a full university, so now we have 2 universities in Oslo, and 5, 6, 7 altogether in Norway. We're a small country, as I said. I've been working a lot with the role of media in democracies, in democracy building. I did my PhD in South Africa, where I studied the role of news in the period after apartheid and the nation-building period, when South Africa, as you know, went from being an apartheid regime and to become a full democracy in 1994 with the arrival of Nelson Mandela. And the role news played both in telling the history of the country, because in many ways they had to reinvent their own history. From one day to another, it was a racist government. Only 10% of the population had rights, human rights even. And then the following day, it was a democracy. And of course, also the stories, the news had to reflect this change. And that's fascinating. Somebody said that news is the first draft of history, so that might be the bridge from what we're talking about here today to the rest of the day, where history will be in focus. So I worked in different African countries. Today I work a lot of study and do research, and we have 7 PhD students in my research group working on the role of media journalism in post-conflict societies, how journalism is a very central actor in the process of a country becoming a democracy after a conflict or a war, or that very difficult process that might be. Let me start with this quote. "A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting its boots on." It's an old quote, and interestingly, it's very hard to tell who actually said it first. This very good quote about misinformation, there are so many misinformed stories connected to it. Many people think that Mark Twain, the American writer, was the one who said this quote. But if we go through all the books of Mark Twain, the closest quote we will find is the one, "Falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it." So it's similar, but it's not exactly the same. Many people think that it's Winston Churchill, the English Prime Minister during the Second World War, who said this quote. But actually, Churchill quotation expert, Mr. Langworth, some years ago, 10 years ago, went through all the quotes that have been incorrectly ascribed to the statement, and this was one of the most famous ones that actually Churchill never said. So that's an interesting story about a very good quote. But actually this quote somehow gives the lead and the tone for my little speech here. Because this quote, I will argue, is more appropriate than ever. There is today a big concern worldwide about how false news and the possibility that these false news have to influence political, economic and social well-being. It seems that false news these days are everywhere, and maybe that is because it is. I talked to a good friend of mine who is the head of the Norwegian Journalist Union the other day, and she said, "I'm so tired of this expression fake news, because there is not such a thing as fake news. Either it's news or it's fake. Fake news is a contradiction in terms." And of course it is, if you define news as being verifiable information in the public interest. Information that doesn't meet these standards does not deserve to be called news. So it is in many ways a contradiction in terms, an oxymoron, if we compare it to the real quality news that we will talk a little bit more about as well. There is another reason too why the concept of fake news, although being enormously popular, it was actually this Australian dictionary called Macquarie Dictionary called fake news the word of the year 2 years ago in 2016. And I'm sure you heard fake news. It's used a lot. But the 2 last years, the term fake news, the concept itself has become increasingly challenged, both because many people argue that it is a contradiction in term, but also because people start to use it on material information that they do not like. And a very good example here is, of course, the President of the United States of America, who uses fake news all the time when he hears stories that he doesn't agree with. Or when the authorities of Myanmar, not long ago, said that the whole story about the Rohingya refugees is fake news. That is, of course, also an example of the use of this concept. Therefore, a lot of scholars, researchers, and others now feel that there is time to do a semantic rebranding to find new ways of saying fake news, because fake news has been so much connected to among others, state leaders who do not like the news or the information. So we increasingly hear about false news. Some people call it junk news, or just the broader term misinformation. Whatever we call this type of misinformation, and I was asked by the Norwegian dictionary, Store Norske Leksikon, which is now an online dictionary, the largest Norwegian dictionary, to help them define the concept of false news recently. And we agreed that false news are representations that look like ordinary news, but where the purpose is to mislead. And this is very important, because if you have a media house, a newsroom, a journalist committing a mistake, of course it's false, it's an error, it's not right, it's untrue. But you cannot call it false news, because the idea here of the definition of false news we mean is that it has to have the purpose to mislead. Somebody really uses the news to put something true. Very often as part of impact work or propaganda. So we see that standard journalistic tools are used to capture attention and create confidence, so that people actually think, reading these news, that they are real, they are true. Here it is, of course, also very important, as those of you who are journalists in the room very well know, to separate between facts and meanings. And of course, meanings, it's much harder to say something can be truthful to a person and another person will react differently to it. But we're now talking about facts, what factually actually happens. Then some people believe that false news is a new event, but not at all. It has always probably existed. People have told each other lies or misinformation in order to obtain certain results. It's probably very small for those of you in the back, but it is the first page of the New York Herald newspaper, almost 150 years ago, 1874. And it is a fascinating example of false news already at that time. The big first page news is about that all the wild animals of the Central Park Zoo had escaped into the streets of New York City. And this news created a lot of horror, of course, and fright. It was inside the newspaper, a long, long written article with tiny little letters, and towards the end of the long article, the journalist said that this was just an invented story, because he found that there was a big risk that because the zoo was not taken well enough care of, so this could very well happen. And also, probably the journalist wrote this because he was not in favor of the actual president getting re-elected, so he had a reason to do so too. Anyhow, most people didn't come to the end of that long article. They were just very, very scared, and maybe they had children or family or friends outside. So people were running out in the streets, and it created a real horror scene. So we see that false news is nothing new. And also that this can be called false news because the journalists probably wanted to weaken the actual President Grant's possibility of re-election. And we've seen, of course, during wars, especially during wars, during conflicts, or during periods where patriotism is considered to be particularly important, the truth is easily sacrificed. And a saying goes that the first casualty of war is truth, and there is a lot of truth in that saying. We see that when wars go on, conflicts go on, propaganda machines come in all types of countries. At the same time, what has happened recently is that increased knowledge of opinion formation, but also, of course, new types of information technology, the digital media, has made it so much easier for people to fabricate news stories that look real. And this is perhaps the most important, we now have all of us, all the audiences, it's so easy for us to spread, to disseminate this information. It's just a click on our smartphone and it's out there. This is a false news, very recent false news from a Norwegian website. So it's what false news may look like in 2008. It's about Greta, that old lady, 92 years old, who is about to be thrown out of her nursing home because the nursing home will be turned into a center for asylum seekers. And you can see that just under the headline, you have the possibility to retweet and to put this, sharing this story on Facebook, and that is a very important element here. Well, we see how the increased use of misinformation is used to manipulate the audiences, and this is the Greta example, a very good example of. Very often, it's used by political far right to create discontentment and fear, but not at all always. False news are used by all kind of ideologies and political sides. But these days we see it a lot in the so-called alt-right movements who are very good and use it in an expert way. And the story about Greta was, of course, not true. Well, of course not, maybe not of course not. It had so many points that it looked true, and many people felt that it could be true because it resonated into their view on the world. So this is the fact checker, Norwegian fact checker called faktisk.no. We now know there are fact checkers in many different countries internationally. And what these fact checkers do is that they go through the news, especially on digital media and social media, and they check whether this is factual information. And then they publish in a similar way this story. No, Greta, 92, is not going to be thrown out of her nursing home because it's going to become an asylum seekers center. And it goes through point by point why this is a false story. The problem here is that even after stories are shown to the public that this is a false story, a fake news, a lot of the damage has already happened because people have shared this, and the story, the news story, somehow lives its own life out there. Very often these made-up stories are feeding into spheres with the public that is already very much critical to some issues. So for instance, this one was specifically tailored to a public which is very much critical to asylum seekers, to immigrants, and also who feel that, well, it was done in a way that put two weak groups up against each other, wasn't it? The old elderly people, and that our Norwegian elderly now suffer because of the asylum seekers. So to some people, this might resonate. Oh, this is exactly what I knew. This is how it is. And then, perhaps without checking further, they spread the news very quickly, and such news, sensational news like this, spread very, very rapidly. Some characteristics of false news that are made up by such lie factories, or even sometimes called troll factories, when the aim is to destroy a politician, for instance, the reputation of a public person. Very often you see that, and these are also some of the criteria that the fact-finder organizations will use in their work. You will see that there are sensational headlines. Well, there's nothing new in sensational headlines. We might find that in a lot of tabloid newspapers. But they are specifically created to create strong feelings and to divide very often the audience and increase political polarization. Often, at least in languages like my own, when it's written in Norwegian and in many other smaller languages as well, this might not be the case in the English press or the English-speaking press. But a sign that this might not be a true story could be that it's very poorly translated from foreign articles. Sometimes you see that they've used Google Translate. Although Google Translate is much better today than it used to be, you will quite easily see that this is not somebody who's native Norwegian speaker. Or even, it depends on the quality, because some of these lie factories are very professional and very good, but some are also not so good qualitatively speaking, so you will see that the language is poor. That might be a sign. But more important, experts and interviews are made up. So it's not so difficult if you use the name of the expert in the article, Google it, you will see that that person doesn't exist. Of course, sometimes they might use real living experts, but then it's much easier to find out that is a false story. So usually these experts and interviews will be made up. The illustrations, the images are often stolen from other media. So you can also, you know, these days you can cut out an image and you can Google search an image and you can see where it's used elsewhere. And often you will see that this image, the old Greta lady, for instance, it was used somewhere else, but it had nothing to do with this Greta story. The site, the media house, often has a name that looks and seems like an ordinary newspaper. If you have the evening press, it could be, for instance, the evening news instead, and try to make a logo that looks like a professional, traditional legacy media. The journalist is not named, no editor has been specified, and there is no contact information for the editorial staff. So if you do a little bit of investigation, you will see that this is not a true story. Yes, and also there are other signs that we can look after. I touched upon them now: professionalism, style, credibility, bias, counterfeit. So these are the lists that these fact checkers will go through. And of course the background here is that the media ecology is changing and has changed very rapidly in a few years' time. The time where everybody was reading more or less the same newspaper, or maybe one of two newspapers, where everybody watched the same evening news at the same time. Benedict Anderson, the historian, said that it was thanks to the print press and the first newspapers that the nation state could come into being, because then people were able to relate to each other and a feeling of a nation could be created. Because although you were in the north or the south, the west or the east of the country, and you would never meet with your other country fellows in person, you would have a feeling of belonging because you shared the same stories. And of course the same songs and culture and language, but that the press, the media, the news were so central in bringing people together. And I think, well, some of us remember growing up and there was one channel on TV and everybody watched the same news, but also the same film. In Norway there was a film every Monday on TV, and then everybody watched that film, good film, bad film, Finnish dark film, whatever was there on Monday evenings, everybody watched it. And everybody talked about it Tuesday and maybe Wednesday and Thursday as well, because there wasn't a new film until next Monday. These times are definitely past us, and it's easy to be romantic about it maybe, but and there are very good things about the ability to choose. It's also good from a democratic perspective that much more voices share the public sphere. But of course there are some downsides to this, and this is how we should look closer into the false news problematic. Also that some people stay within their little limited spheres and they do not have contact with other opinions. This is what we call the echo chambers. Today, if you have a particular interest, you can choose to go into a group on the internet, create your own little group if you'd like, and you discuss issues with your like-minded, which could be sometimes very good if you have a particular interest and nobody in your neighborhood is interested in the same thing. It's wonderful, you feel that you belong somewhere. But it's also quite dangerous when it comes to the proliferation of non-democratic issue, for instance. I'm sure you heard about the terrorist attack in my country in 2011, where a Norwegian young man went out and killed 77 young people on an island and also blew up part of our government buildings in Oslo. This was a young man who lived his life on internet, in some dark spaces on internet, and who never received any other ideas than these Nazi, fascist, dangerous ideas. The old Enlightenment ideas, the old philosophers from several hundred years back, the whole concept of the Enlightenment ideas was that all ideas get better, get stronger, get truer if we're able to debate them and if they meet opposition. Although you might be completely sure about your own meaning, your own idea that you are right, it's always good to have a good discussion and to get some other perspectives. And if your idea is so good and so right, it will probably only get stronger to meet some resistance, to meet some other perspectives. And maybe you might also change a bit your own opinion. What happens in these echo chambers is that you don't have any shared experience and values from outside your own group anymore. Earlier, you had to go through, although you were not interested in the whole newspaper, at least you would go briefly through it and see what happened in other spheres. If you watched the evening news, you would see what happened a bit around in other parts and hear a bit of some other voices, if the evening news were well made, that is. But today, you may spend your life within a closed little room with no input from outside, and that is problematic. We see that more and more people get their news primarily through social media. Again, an example from my own country, where people still read a lot of newspapers, but the largest media arena is Facebook, because people share articles through Facebook. So Facebook is larger than any other media house in Norway now. And we also know that Facebook in terms of number is the largest country in the world. Facebook is larger than China in number of inhabitants. although China is not on Facebook, paradoxically, as we know. In these echo chambers and in the use of digital media, we trigger algorithms. And some of you might be very knowledgeable about this, but the thing is that when we do a Google search, when we search on something, the machine, the program will remember us, which is good, so that we get some help next time we search. They will know that we like this kind of articles and this kind of field, so it's very helpful, these algorithms. But these algorithms also tend to give us more and more of the same. So in terms of news, when we do a search on news, we will get more and more the same kind of news written by people who are quite similar to ourselves. And then the problem is that some outlets thrive by telling their audience precisely what they want to hear. So we can imagine that this Greta story about the old lady was tailored to those people very skeptical to immigration, very, very skeptical about asylum seekers. And when they read this story, they said, oh, that's exactly, I knew it, that's how it is. They're throwing our old people out in the street to take care of those asylum seekers. And it really, I think that's a very human characteristic, a human trait, that we like to get our own ideas, to get them stressed and emphasized and proved from elsewhere. There's a lot of interesting research here. I won't spend a long time on this, but you know there were elections in Sweden just very recently, 3 weeks back, and already some interesting research comes out to see how social media news are used in Sweden and also within the field of false news. Swedish social media users share the most junk news or fake news of all European countries that they've been compared to in all the European elections studied recently. Of course, it's the latest election too, so that might be part of the explanation. But for every second professional news, 1 junk news was shared, and the ratio here was in Germany 4:1, UK 5:1, and France 7:1. So there was a lot of false news within the public sphere in relation to the Swedish elections. We often think that a lot of these false news originate from Russia, because of course that is the big discussion now after the elections in 2016 that Donald Trump won, and that is still under investigation, how much cooperation there was between the Trump campaign and Russia. So that was also something the Swedish researchers looked into, but only 0.2% of the false news discovered in relation to the elections in Sweden last month originated from Russia. Most of them, these false news, were distributed by what we call automated bots. And some of you seem to know what bots are. Bot is, and this I think is something we should all know, because it becomes increasingly important and it is challenging our public sphere, so we should all be aware of these bots. Bots may be very useful. They are automated social media accounts. They are used in social media networks to automatically generate messages or to retweet tweets, so that if you send out or create a fake tweet, these bots can help you very, very quickly to distribute them to a lot of people. Some people think that bots are bad, that they are they're made to do bad things from a democratic perspective. But bots are it's just a technical tool. It's also, you find bots, for instance, in search engines, so they are very useful too. But again, they can be used and misused. But bots are important to explain how a message can spread very, very fast, and especially in elections times when we see that false news are constructed and spread to have an impact on the final results. Bots are very useful, or maybe very useful, and we saw that in the Swedish elections they were used a lot. told, I'm not a technician myself, but I'm told that it's very easy to make a bot if you're a little bit into coding. It's not a very complicated thing to do. So there are a lot of bots out there. I have some numbers if you're interested. They think that about 15% of the total Twitter population in the US presidential elections were bots. And they think that at least 400,000 bots were responsible for about 3.8 million tweets in that period. So there are automated accounts, and they mess with the ecosystem, with the natural kind of like and share system that social media use. But sometimes it's also very difficult to tell whether a high frequency account is a bot or a real person, because we also know that some people very dedicated to a cause are extremely active on social media. So it's not, sometimes people have been surprised, they thought it was a bot and they realized no, it's a living person just being extremely active on the internet. But it's important for all of us to be aware that these kind of automated robots exist, and also to discuss whether we need to regulate them more, because they are expected to play a major role in future shaping of public opinion. But most of all, that we should all be aware the fact that what we read might come from different senders than what we believe it is. Some bots also create content themselves, or they can be told to distribute content in a very quick way. There's another study I wanted to quickly tell you about, that's from MIT. They found some interesting findings from earlier this year. They found that these researchers, American researchers, found that false Twitter stories have 70% more chance to be spread in social media than a true story. Also, they found that a fake story, falsehood, diffused 6 times faster. So here we're back to the boots again, huh? That a lie travels much quicker than a true story. It's actually now proven according to these MIT researchers. And why is it so? Maybe it's because some of these made-up stories are just too good. They're so good that you feel you have to spread them. If you believe that immigrants are taking over Norway and kicking out our elderly people, of course, when you see it black and white, you want to show it to your friends and family. That's what I knew. That's exactly how it is. But also, the researchers argue that the degree of novelty that most of us, we like to be early on with a new story. So if we see a spectacular new story, it gives us some sort of status to spread it in our social media. So that is also part of the explanation. But a very important finding is that falsehood diffused significantly farther, faster, deeper and more broadly than the truth in all categories of information, and particularly in political news. And the effects were more pronounced for political news than for other news. But these researchers, Usogi and his colleagues, they found that actually that most of these fake news, false news, were spread by human beings and not by bots. So they explain it more in a psychological way, that human beings too, we like the feeling of being in the right. We like it when our news give us reason and agree with us. And that might be part of why we share without checking. If a story seems too good to be true, it probably is. I think that is the lesson learned here, and that is what we should teach our young children and also ourselves, because it's very easy to be taken by a sensational news story that just seems to prove what you've always known. I talked a little bit about the fact checkers. They're important, and there is now an international organization of all the different fact checkers. They want to manifest their work in April the 2nd, which is interesting because at least in my country, and I think in most of Europe, 1st of April is Fool's Day. It's when you're allowed to tell a joke, a lie to your parents or your friends. My father always woke up on Fool's Day and said there is a moose in the garden. So that was his yearly fake news. But April 2nd is then the next day, the following day of Fool's Day. So maybe that's why they've chosen April the 2nd. I don't know this. This is just what I like to think. Maybe it's a false news here, misinformation. It has to be double-checked. But they have selected the April 2nd, and I'm quite sure. I like to think that it is because it's the day after Fool's Day. Then we need to verify our sources. And we know that newspapers also like to distribute and disseminate the best April Fool's jokes. So maybe the 2nd of April is a good day to have a specific focus on the need for fact-checking. Let me see how I'm doing on time here. Yes, we need to have some time for discussion too. So, yeah, memes. My youngest son told me quite some time ago what a meme is. Mom, don't you know what a meme is? And of course I knew, just didn't know it was called. You're a professor in journalism, media, you don't know what a meme is. And of course I knew what it is, but at the time I didn't know it was called a meme. It's what you find all the time. Some of them are jokes, some of them are news. But you usually have a picture and you have a small quote, good quote. This is a very good one. We're back to Winston Churchill, who did not give you the quote of the boots. But did he say fake quotes will ruin the internet? Probably not either. But it's very often a comment to current news. And we see that also these memes have, and maybe on people who do not spend so much time on reading long, serious articles, will find a lot of information in these short snapshots, and perhaps especially young people who now are so used to images, to things going quickly, sound bites, and this is a very good way of getting some information out. So this is also where we find a lot of false information, such as the one, maybe I think this was made in a humoristic way, that Winston Churchill said that fake quotes will ruin the internet. These days there are people who work a lot with how to recognize a fake story. And very often, to sum it up, it is, if it seems too good to be true, check it twice. Read past the headline, check what news outlet published it, check the publish date and time. Some of these stories that travel around the internet, some of them are very old, but they get used again in a new political context, in a new news context, and they get a very different, well, it's probably possible to read them in a very different way. Who is the author? Look at what links and sources are used. Questionable quotes and photos. Beware confirmation bias. Search if other news outlets are reporting it. If something spectacular, sensational happens, all journalists in the room will know, it won't take long before more media houses, more newsroom catch up the good story. So if you find a very, very interesting good story and nobody else is talking about it, then that is a sign that we should be aware of. Of course, what we frequently see and increasingly see is that the legacy media, the traditional media, also tend to pick up false news from the internet. And the dialogue, so to speak, between traditional media and the new digital media, it's also a very interesting relationship here. I won't spend time on that now. The last one, perhaps the most important one, think before you share. Because one thing is to create a fake, false story. The biggest problem, as we see here, is that it's so much shared and that it continues to live. Although people have, fact checkers or others have proven that this is wrong. What is the background for my speech here is, of course, the societal role of the news. The role that news is supposed to play in any democracy. If it wasn't for this, it wouldn't be that dangerous that there are lots of different stories, jokes, false news, misinformation out there. But this takes us really to the core of why it's important to talk about news, why news play a very important role. And there is a lot to be said about this, but I can quickly sum it up to 4 central points. And in each of these points there are many books to be read and many discussions to be had. We can come back to some of it in the discussion if you'd like. But of course the major idea or the core societal role of the media, of the news, is to provide information about people's rights. About people's rights, because people who do not know about their rights, in fact, they are rightless. And we see this in a lot of countries where illiteracy levels are high, for instance, that there might be rights that people have on the paper, but they don't know about them, so they're worthless. Then it's the second one, the very often referred to as the watchdog role, and that is the important role of discovering illegal actions and protect people from corruption and wrongdoing. So that is also one of the ideals role of good journalism, of the real news, of quality journalism. Then it is to function as a two-way channel between those who govern and those who are governed. Very often those who govern, they live in a little sphere and they're not so connected to the grassroots, to the rest of the society anymore, and then it's considered to be the role of the news to give also the governed ideas about what's happening in their country, in their communities, and the other way around, to be a way that power and people can communicate. And then increasingly the last year, these 3 firsts have been discussed for many, many years. And the last years we see increasingly the need for the media to serve as identity suppliers. And this is not least important in periods after conflict or wars. That everybody should feel that they belong and that media can play a very important role in letting them get that feeling. This can be done through who introduces the news, for instance. Could be a question of ethnicities, of gender, of different groups of society. Yes. This is a quote by George Orwell, who wrote, as you know, 1984. He wrote it in 1948. I think it was published in 1949. And he said, or wrote in his novel 1984, "A world in which there is no verifiable truth, but only varied forms of propaganda, in which lies are repeated so often and so insistently that they become reality, where the audience is so exhausted and baffled by falsehoods that it no longer knows or cares where the truth lies." So this is a frightening image of a post-truth society, and I think we should all strive for us and our societies not to come to this stage that George Orwell so well described many, many years ago.